My name is Jessa Madosky, and I'm currently an assistant professor of instruction at the University of Tampa. And I'm speaking to you from unceded lands that were originally Coast Salish tribal land, including the Suk, the Saanich, the Songhe, the Lummi, and the Samish peoples. I present as femme, and I have an invisible disability. And that intersection has been really interesting in the world of conservation. I have lost 2 jobs due to gender discrimination, where my contracts were not renewed when in one case I brought up a case of a faculty member making sexual comments about our female boss and about female students. And my contract was not renewed because I was having trouble getting along with my colleagues. And in another case, my contract was not renewed after a colleague brought up disparate treatment between myself and a male colleague. And somehow my contract ended up not being reviewed. And one of the search members for that, I had to reapply for my own job. And one of the search members of that committee actually said, I'm not even sure why you didn't end up in our top 2 candidates. It just kind of didn't happen. And there was a lot going on in that in terms of, a lot of uproar within the department and the couple departments actually because of those allegations that were brought forward, not by me, but actually by a colleague. And then as somebody with an invisible disability, I'm currently fighting my current institution because they are refusing to provide appropriate accommodations for my disability. I kept it secret for quite a long time because I was worried about the repercussions of people knowing that I had an invisible disability. I've faced a lot of discrimination out in the general world, especially because my disability is invisible and I have a service dog. I'm often questioned about why do I have a service dog or what's wrong with me, which is interesting that people standing behind you in line at the drugstore will ask for your medical diagnosis because you have a dog with you, which doesn't seem like something I'm interested in sharing with general random members of the public, but something that is often asked of me, or I've been kicked out of restaurants multiple times. It's illegal, but it happens unfortunately all the time. And so those 2 identities have really affected my work in terms of literally losing jobs and having to move around the country to find different jobs and things like that. It also makes doing my research more challenging. I've moved more away from field work over the years because of my disability, making it really challenging to do field work, and moved more towards human wildlife interaction work when, in an ideal situation, I would prefer to be out in the field more often, but often my disability makes that really challenging for me. It's also important for me to recognize that as somebody who is white, that has given me a lot of advantages as I've moved through my career as well. I also come from a middle class background where both of my parents have advanced degrees. So it never occurred to me that I wouldn't go to college or things like that. And when I decided to go to grad school, I had lots of people who could guide me in how that process worked. And my white privilege allows me to enter spaces that many other people wouldn't be able to enter and do conservation in a way that a lot of other people wouldn't have the opportunity to do conservation. So really for me to recognize both some of the disadvantages I've had through some parts of my identity, but also realizing that I have a lot of advantages from other aspects of my identity, which I think is something that we often need to think about, realizing that that intersection is not just how it affects us negatively, but also how it affects us positively. And I actually had an incident where I was on a high-level phone conference call with the executive director of SCB Global and the operational director of SCBNA, and was harassed by one of the security officers at my current place of employment because I had my service dog with me. And at that time, those individuals didn't know that I had a service dog, didn't know that I had an invisible disability. But the police officer, the security officer at my institution, stopped me in the parking lot and refused to let me go into the building because I had a dog and dogs weren't allowed on campus. And when I tried to explain that I was a professor and that my dog was allowed and I would be happy to explain the circumstances later after I was off my call, he kept harassing me. And so finally I had to, while on the high level call, explain that I had an invisible disability and that my dog was a service dog and that I had already registered him with HR and security had already been notified of his presence months before. And I actually ended up having to call HR and the head of security to let them know that this type of harassment was creating a toxic workplace and that it needed to stop. And once I brought up the words toxic workplace, which is something that's protected or prohibited, I should say, in federal law, all of a sudden things changed and I haven't been hassled by security since. But, you know, there were multiple instances of that happening where, you know, my right to have certain accommodations was questioned by people extensively in authority who had not gotten the memo that that had already been approved. Well, unfortunately, as I mentioned before, I've lost 2 jobs due to gender discrimination. And so in that case, I had to find a different working environment that would be more welcoming, i.e. hire me. In that case, that's kind of the extreme version of more welcoming. And it definitely changed how I talked about issues like that. And I went through a period of time when I thought about doing my work as an academic, where I was told by many people to just keep my head down until I got tenure, to not talk about issues of social justice or discrimination until I got tenure, even if it was, you know, a situation where I was sincerely concerned that a faculty member might sexually assault a female student. And I was told just to keep my head down. And I had some long thoughts about this and made the decision that I think the taboo we have about talking about gender discrimination, about talking about racial discrimination, about talking about having a disability, let alone being discriminated against for having a disability, is a huge part of that problem that allows these discriminatory events to keep going on. There's a sense of shame that's connected to that. I remember one case where I was at a conference for SCB, and it was the first conference I brought my service dog to, essentially outing myself as having some sort of disability. Although many people thought I was training the service dog for somebody else, they were surprised to learn that it was in fact my service dog and that I'd had him for over a decade. And these were people that I had a strong working relationship with, and I was currently serving as the president for SCB North America. And I specifically decided to come out, so to speak, at that particular moment as having a disability because I was the president overseeing that particular conference. And I thought it was important for people in our field to realize that somebody who they perceived as a leader, or at least many people perceived as a leader, they voted me in, right? Although it was an uncontested election, apparently nobody would run against me, said the board. I don't know how true that was, but somebody who was perceived at least as a leader actually was somebody that, unbeknownst to most of them, had a disability. And so I was at that conference, I had my service dog, and I went with a colleague who was a staff member at SCB Global, simply to the local store across the street from the conference because we wanted to pick up something to eat before we went to another appointment, and we were just wanting to have a chat with each other. And I walked into the convenience store and immediately the owner or the person behind the counter, the manager, said that I wasn't allowed to have my dog. And the person who I was with stepped up and said, this is her service dog. You know, she's allowed to have this dog. It's her service dog. And the manager still said, well, there's no dogs allowed. And I said, you know, you have to allow him. He's a service dog. But in that moment, having somebody else step up and say some of those words so I didn't have to feel like I was the only person fighting that battle was incredibly validating and incredibly helpful, just because it is a constant thing that I deal with everywhere I go. I never know when somebody's going to try to kick me out of a restaurant or try to kick me out of a store or something like that because of my service dog that I need, but people can't see my disability. So either it's perceived as I'm cheating. There's a lot of culture around people supposedly cheating to take their dog with them everywhere. And having a colleague simply say, hey, that's not cool. This is her service dog. You need to let her in, was a huge relief to me. And it made a huge difference. And, you know, it was a 5-second thing for her. You know, it wasn't something that was terribly hard for her to do, but it made a huge influence on my day and how I felt in that moment, facing that discrimination yet another time, just knowing that there was somebody else there with me who was standing up for that. My vision for a fully inclusive conservation community is one where people from all sorts of different identities, whether it's racial identity or whether it's gender identity or disability status or, you know, parental status, all these different intersections in our lives that determine our identity as people, are able to really fully participate in conservation in ways that speak to their strengths and in ways that even in some cases might be their weaknesses, but somewhere that they can contribute, even if it might be more challenging for them to contribute in those arenas. We need to make sure that people in a position of privilege are working towards that, as well as people who come from those historically disadvantaged communities and those historically attacked communities.